Recording. And people are coming in. Welcome as you come in. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for coming. You are joining Addressing Systemic Racism, How the Media Impact the Narrative of Black Americans. It is Friday, August 21st, 11:30 to 1:30 p.m. And we are about to start our webinar. I am just getting things ready for our Facebook audience, and we still have people joining, so give us just a few seconds and we will begin our webinar in just 1 second. We hope everybody is doing well. And we are going live. Thank you so much for coming to our webinar. Again, we are addressing systemic racism, how the media impact the narrative of Black Americans. We have more than 165 people who have registered, and so we hope they will join as soon as possible. We're getting up there, the audience is growing. One thing that we want you to do is make sure that when you have questions, please feel free to ask those in the chat. We have team members that will let us know when we have questions, and we will try to get all of your questions answered throughout our panel discussion. I probably neglected to tell you that I am Vivian King, and I'm the communications advisor for the UW Center for Community Engagement and Health Partnership. And we have a dynamic panel discussion for you. It's a little different from what we've done before, but we hope you enjoy it. The visionary for this webinar is none other than our own leader of the Center for Community Engagement and Health Partnership, Gina Green Harris, who is the director. And at this time, I bring her to you so she can give you a few words of greetings and just a little history of why we decided to do this. Gina.
Good morning, everyone. Of course, the mute button is always everyone's friend in these conferences and webinars. As Vivian said, my name is Gina Green Harris, and I'm director of the Center for Community Engagement and Health Partnerships. And I am excited to welcome you to our third webinar series about addressing systemic racism. To our panelists, I am excited and want to thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss the impact of media and the narrative it means for Black folks in this country. As Vivian said, we started this seminar and these webinars, quite frankly, on Juneteenth Day, right? We know Juneteenth is the day we're supposed to be celebrating our liberation and freedom and all those wonderful things that the Constitution is supposed to support for all folks. But we also know that on Juneteenth Day 2020, we were in the heat of COVID-19. We were in the crux of racial uprising because of the George Floyd circumstances and situation, and just quite frankly, the addressing of the systemic racism that has been in this country far too long. And so it was the thought to say that it's really important to me and I think just for our community's sake that we begin to start addressing systemic racism in a way and in a platform whereby which we are using people who look like, quite frankly, the issue. So what our goal was and the vision is to identify African Americans who are credible, who are experts in their fields, who actually are living this experience of being Black while understanding being oppressed and marginalized by systemic racism, but to start changing the narrative of what's really happening behind the scenes. And who better to tell our stories than us? And who better to share this added pieces of information about what we are experiencing as Black people than us, and also to offer solutions. I don't know about you, but I've sat in multiple meetings where people, particularly our white counterparts, are saying, I don't know what to do. How do we address systemic racism? What can we do to make change? Well, that's what these seminars are about. These webinars are for us to discuss the issue, but also to say, here's some tidbits of information that you can practically apply to start addressing these things in a systemic way. Here's how we're going to address organizational change, because those are the questions that we've been answering. And I just happen to believe that we actually do have solutions that people can actually implement, and it doesn't take the next 10 years to do it. So that is the reason why we've done these. And as Vivian said, we started out our series talking about the issues of systemic racism, from historical trauma all the way to last session. We talked about how medicine and medical systems are impacting our health and our well-being, and why is it that Black folks are constantly on the bottom of the food chain. And so we're going to be talking about now the media. What role does the media play in how it portrays Black folks, and how has that impacted us on every level possible, from social economic status to housing to transportation? How are we viewed in commercials? How are we viewed in violence? All those are relevant to our livelihood. So I'm excited that you all as experts, Mark Russell and Joanne Williams, and I've got to get your name right, Ajiana, did I say it right?
Perfect.
Yes. And how are we going to learn from you today? What do we need to understand about media, and how do we address that? I want to just share and give a shout out to all of our partners involved. So if you go back to that former screen, Dave, that would be great, because I want to show our partners that are involved with this. It is our center. It is the Life Course Initiative for Healthy Families. It is the All of Us Research Program, the Wisconsin Alzheimer's Institute, in particular, the Milwaukee Regional Office, and then, of course, the Wisconsin Partnership Program, which supports our LIFE program, the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, and of course, our Helen Bader or Bader Philanthropies, who help support our work as well. So without our partners, we would not be able to do this series, but with them, we have lifted up this information. And coming from the School of Medicine and Public Health, it is critical that we bring this information in a format that everyone can receive something from and use in their practices. I do want to give a shout out to the participants on the webinar. Because of your great response, because you guys have been asking for more, we have turned this into a monthly series, at least through the end of 2020, to continue to address this, and we will bring relevant topics to this space based on what we hear from the evaluations and from the reviews. And so we are incredibly excited. I won't belabor the moment, but I also want to just thank everyone. Vivian King, I want to give you a special shout out for your just energy around all of this, willing to moderate, and thank you for grabbing our speakers for this series. And we are excited. And from there, I will release you back into the hands of Vivian and say thank you, and thank you. Vivian, you are on mute.
Mute always gets us, doesn't it? Normally it doesn't get me, but today it did. So thank you, Gina. At least everybody knew I was on mute, and now I'm not. So first, let me introduce our panels. Two of them are very good friends of mine, and one is a new friend of mine. So first, I'm going to start with Joanne Williams. And Joanne is the host of Black Nouveau with Milwaukee PBS. But if you've been in Milwaukee any time, any amount of time, you know that she was an anchor at Fox 6, and she has been in this this career for a long, long time. She was a regional director on the board of the National Association of Black Journalists, a founding member of the Wisconsin Black Media Association, a past president of the Milwaukee Press Club. So Joanne and I, of course, saw each other in the field. We also worked together with the Wisconsin Black Media Association. She is a member of the Milwaukee Press Club Hall of Fame and a National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Silver Circle honoree. In 2014, the Milwaukee Business Journal honored her as a woman of influence for her inspiration to others. Even while she is hosting Black Nouveau, she basically started and created a film, a documentary. And so she'll probably talk about that a little bit later as well, because it is talking about racial relationships. And so I give to you Joanne Williams. Second, Mark Russell. Mark Russell and I went to school together. And so Mark is a veteran newsroom leader. He's the executive editor of the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, Tennessee. He started his news career as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Plain Dealer in Cleveland, Ohio, covering a range of business and political topics. He also worked as an assistant metro editor at the Plain Dealer and the Boston Globe. Now, he served 5 years as a Pulitzer Prize juror, including as a judge for the prestigious Public Service Award and a stint as chair of the commentary jury in 2020. And the Orlando Sentinel, under Russell's leadership as editor, was a Pulitzer finalist in 2013 for coverage of the hazing death of a band member of the FAMU Marching 100. In '84, he graduated from the University of Missouri with a degree in journalism with an emphasis on news editorial. That's where we met. He received a Missouri Honor Medal for Distinguished Service in Journalism, the journalism program's highest award. He received that in 2011. Again, that is Mark Russell. And last, but certainly not least, we have Angiana Nurdine. She is a senior at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, majoring in reporting. She is currently a reporter for Wisconsin Watch. She serves as the student representative on the board of directors for the National Association of Black Journalists, as well as the president for NABJ UW. And I know that we can't hear you, but you are definitely giving my friends and our panelists a huge round of applause. So I want to start with when I called you and told you about our topic, addressing systemic racism, how the media impact the narrative of Black Americans. What was your initial reaction?
I'll start and say that my reaction was that there's no better time than right now to have this discussion, given the reckoning that we're undergoing as a country right now over the issues of social justice and systemic racism. And also, it's a really good time too, because it's coming right off the political convention for the DNC and right before the one for the RNC, where I think these kind of issues will get great scrutiny. So I'm just glad to be here, and I think it's a perfect time for this.
I agree with you, and I think it's a good time to have this conversation. But my initial reaction when Vivian called me was, we're going to talk about this again. I have been talking about this since I started working in television news. And things have changed, the technology has changed, the people have changed, but some of the attitudes and approaches to the media and the way we disseminate information to Americans have not changed. So I'm happy to talk about it again.
Yeah, to echo my fellow panelists, I think that when I first heard this question, I was like, yes, I'm so happy we're having this conversation. And I think just from a journalism student perspective, coming up and learning kind of what role the media plays, and then also taking part in, everything that's happened recently with the protests and with the pandemic, and then learning about how the media responds to issues that affect Black Americans. I think that was it was crazy to see, I think, as a journalism student, and learn how to become a journalist, and then also see from the back end how it affects Black Americans. So again, I think that this conversation is desperately needed.
So I want David to advance the slides so you can see some slides that one of our previous panelists and presenters presented to us. Dr. Marcellus Merritt, who's a PhD at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, he was talking just about systemic racism and all parts of it. And so he got to media bias, and he showed these two pictures and talked about, at first in his presentation, he just showed the pictures without the captions, without the news organizations. And he asked the panelists, asked the attendees what they saw. And people guessed, and then somebody finally guessed Hurricane Katrina. And then he showed us what the caption was. And so the first one says, the top photo, young Black man walks through chest deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. And the bottom one says, two residents wade through chest deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store after Hurricane Katrina. And so your thoughts about the different captions, and especially what was really going on here in these photos.
So I'll start and say, I remember these captions and these photos from Hurricane Katrina. And I think what this illustrates, particularly with that top photo, is the unconscious bias at play among some in the media to presume if this caption is written before you know the facts, that means you're presuming to know what happened here when you don't know anything at all except what you see in the image. And you can presume that the person is carrying their own belongings, or you can presume something more sinister like what's in the caption. But you have to do the reporting and check to make sure before you ever do a caption like this, because it damages the credibility of all in the media when this kind of thing happens. Because people in the community presume that we are going to be fair and balanced. And when we're not, it damages it completely.
I agree with Mark, but the true journalists would have checked the facts to see if either of those statements were true before putting them in as a caption. But the way media has changed and the way people approach the information they put out nowadays, sometimes these kind of captions just get generated and there is no editorial control or oversight before they get posted wherever they get posted. And then you have to go back and do a retraction if you have enough ethics to do a retraction. So I think that's one of the dangers we have to look out for in the new media of the 21st century, that everything you see in the media that you consume is not necessarily fact, but true journalists will find out if it's facts, and you have to learn how to be a savvy consumer of the media.
Exactly.
Yeah. I would like to also, I think looking at this seems like an exercise that they would give us in journalism school. And I'm looking at the top photo of the Associated Press, and I'm not sure what the second one stands for, but if you think about in terms of circulation, the AP goes everywhere. And then if you just look at the captions, young Black man, and then New Orleans. And then the second one, two residents after Hurricane Katrina. You're already victimizing one and assuming that one is a problem. And I think that for me, in terms of looking at race and how it affects how we report on things, young Black man, yes, this may be this person's identity, but I think that if you're already addressing that this is a Black person in this area, you're kind of increasing that stereotype that like Black is a problem rather than like the problems that affect Black people are products of other problems. And so when we look at like I said, the two residents, are you assuming that the other person wasn't a resident? And then you also stated that they're looting, and that's, kind of already putting in the minds that, oh, this person is looting, this person is creating a crime. And then assuming that the second people, the other picture, is that they're in some sort of problem and that they need to be saved. And then comparing that to the Black person in terms of like, they need to be stopped.
Yeah, and you know what? You just answered a question popped up from Gina in our chat that said, what is wrong with the perception of how this Black person is looting and the white people are survivors? And we're looking at the picture. You don't have to say he's Black. You already know he's Black. You're right.
And we don't say in the second picture that they're white or anything else. We just say they're two residents.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And someone says yes, and this kind of thinking is so ingrained that I don't know if they realize. Case in point, the whole discussion about Plouffe involvement in Obama's speech. And I'll ask Sharon Jewell ask that question or put that in the comment. But but thank you so much for talking about that. We already talked about, of course, phones are ringing. Sorry about that.
Reminds me to mute mine.
I know, right? I need to turn this off. Sorry, you guys. That phone rarely rings. Anyway, we already talked about, Angiana talked about, you mentioned the protests. And so
Yes.
Black Lives Matter protests are happening around the globe, countered by what some have been calling Blue Lives Matter. And what responsibility does the media have in covering this diametric point of view?
Well, the media should cover all of it. When you're assigned to cover a demonstration, you have to report on an estimated number of people, where they walked, when they marched, what the weather was, were there police present, what happened, and you have to sort of stay apart from it to report those facts. Now, if you're going to report a story about police officers, you have to do the same thing. Where they walked, what happened, who they are, what their purpose was. But you can't put your judgment on your reporting. You have to just report what you see and what happened. It's up to the viewer to decide who they like and who they don't like. But it's up to the media to just present the two sides. Now, the problems we have in 2020 are that a lot of the people who are in media put their opinions and their points of view right in their story. And then you read it and you think that, well, this must be true because it's a news story. It's not necessarily true. It's an opinion. And I want to give a shout out to a friend of ours, a friend of Vivian's and mine, and a CBS reporter. His name is Jeff Pegues. He's written this book for all of you who want to learn about. It's called Black and Blue. It's about Black folks and the police department. And he studied police departments to find out how they were dealing with Black issues and how Black police officers were dealing with it. So I think journalists have a tough job trying to tell these stories, but it's not just one story. And I always remind people that you can't just watch one story and make up your mind. You have to watch all the stories that are reported. And a good reporter goes back to these sources several times to do follow-up stories to bring you more information.
Yeah, good point, Joanne. Let me amplify that a little bit. One of our first Black Lives Matter protest stories within the first week or so after George Floyd's death was a protest in Memphis outside a police precinct where a group of All Lives Matter protesters met Black Lives Matter protesters at the same time in the middle of the street. And we had to really be careful in reporting that story to show what happened. And we decided, because there was a melee at the actual protest, and we had video that showed that the police were essentially protecting the folks that were the All Lives Matter protesters while trying to carton off the Black Lives Matter protesters. And in one instance, we had footage of a police officer running over a BLM protester with a riot shield. And that became a major story for us in the police and launched an investigation. So I think it's important when you have a situation like that, that you stand apart from it as a journalist. You want to be neutral and cover it, but you also want to call the shots as you see them. And in this case, there was a small group of All Lives Matter protesters that tried to disrupt a major peaceful protest that then became a bit of a melee. And we explained what happened in the police role, and which launched an investigation.
Yeah, and I think those are both great points. I also want to share an anecdote. So I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. I was in Madison, Wisconsin this summer. And I believe one of the first protests that we had after George Floyd's death was at the beginning of the summer. And there was an organized protest from about 11 to 3, and people marched from the Capitol all the way down to somewhere on the east side. And then later in the evening, there happened to be a bunch of looting. People were throwing stones. I believe the National Guard was called out, and there were a bunch of police. There was a huge police presence downtown after people were coming back from the protesting that was peaceful. And I remember what happened was the reporters were out there recording, and they got on camera, on film, a white girl kicked in a window of one of the stores on State Street, which is just like a State Street. It's like the most famous street, I want to say, in Madison, Wisconsin, super big touristy location. And they caught it on camera, and someone pulled her to the side and said, "You can't do that because it's going to fall back on us. It's going to fall back on them. You're not going to be held responsible for this." And there was another video that I saw that someone had where they were looting Urban Outfitters, and they caught someone on camera picking things up and walking out of the store, and they didn't look Black. And they were like, "I believe that this person might be an employee and they're working there and they might be trying to, you know," and it was like, if you see it's happening in front of you, all you have to say is, "There's this person, they took something from the store and they left." You know, and I think, Joanne, you mentioned it too, the implicit biases aren't being called out for you to automatically assume that, oh, this person's looting and this person isn't looting, without even doing the research, without even figuring out the fact, without interviewing, without doing any of those things. The media is such a huge presence, and especially including social media, people believe what they see and what they hear. And so you have to use that responsibility of, I'm a reporter, I work for this organization, I have this many followers, this is my platform. You have to use that responsibly. And if you're openly saying, oh, this person did this or this person did that, without even investigating the facts or without calling out the truth, then you're doing a disservice to the entire community. And I think that also just the implicit biases are never brought up. And that's something that I think, in terms of like my student perspective, is so important. They're not taught about the implicit biases that they may have. They may come from some rural place in Wisconsin and never know about, you know, people of color, the issues that affect people of color. And then they come to school, learn how to be a journalist and report on what they see, but they never were addressed on the filters that are affecting what they see. And then they go on to be reporters in bigger locations. And then you get this whole kind of social media versus the media kind of battle between, well, you reported on this and you reported on that. And it just creates a huge discrepancy in the information.
Jana makes a really good point. I wanted to stress something, that we as journalists have a responsibility to both add context and meaning in our coverage to explain what happens and to get behind the scenes a bit on it. So we had a case in Memphis a few months ago where we had, in succession, 3 incidents where vehicles ran into protesters. This has become a national phenomenon and a very troubling phenomenon, because some people think that protesters should not be in public streets, and therefore they don't slow down when they get to the place where there's a protest. We decided to do a story that was a more contextual story, looking nationwide at how often this happens, but then particularly looking at the 3 incidents in Memphis and going into the backgrounds of those who have been charged with what were essentially misdemeanors, to explain what could have been their motivation for doing this. And we found 2 cases where people on social media were posting memes about violence against protesters. And in one case, someone who had literally used expletives and said, "Kill all N-words, kill all Jews." So we were able to very clearly show both motivation and background of the individuals involved, to the point where even the police and the prosecutors had to acknowledge they didn't do enough research on this. So I think it's important that we add background and context on stories like that.
What role do you think statistics play in reporting?
I mean, they're all important because they add context and meaning to stories. And I'll just use COVID-19 as an example. If we aren't using statistics to explain the disparate impact on African Americans and Latinos in our cities, particularly in Memphis, but all over the nation, because it's been that way all over the nation, we're not doing our jobs. And I think it's one way to show the truth of what happens and have people better understand the impact on our communities.
Well, because our news cycles are so quick, we have everybody's 24 hours. I mean, remember the time when you had the evening news? Now it's everybody wants to beat everybody. And so they want to put the information on the news as soon as they get it. So how does that impact getting some of those statistics out?
There's always potential for a follow story. And if you're not looking at follow stories, you're not doing your job. Yeah, I understand that there's a race to get it first and there's a race to get things up quickly, but we have a responsibility to put things in context and to explain and enunciate on issues. One way to do that is to describe the impact in a more granular fashion by using statistics, and also by telling the human story behind the statistics.
Yeah.
You know, statistics are critical when you look at the whole context of what happened in a particular story or what happened to a group of people because of a pandemic. Statistics are very important. But Angiana, will probably substantiate this with me. You don't learn enough about statistics in journalism school, about how to research them, about how to interpret them, about how to use them. And sometimes you have to go to somebody else to get an interpretation of the numbers that you get so that you can make sense of the story you're doing. And that's where I think the media needs to strengthen itself. We need to get people more statistic and data savvy so that we can use these numbers to explain the stories and the situations that we're covering.
That's a very good point, Joanne.
And to echo both of your points, I think, and Mark, you touched on it a little bit too, within those numbers, there's a person, there's a story. And so part of it is like, you can't just report on like these numbers and then follow up with no story, you know, how is it really affecting people? And if we go back to the example with the pictures and with the victims of Hurricane Katrina, those are numbers that they were part of some data set, and those pictures are part of that like story. You see the emotion in those people's faces, but then you look at the captioning and then it tells this completely different story. And so that's where that like irresponsibility is kind of like, well, wait, how are you going to just show this picture, not do the research, and then make people assume that, oh, this person's looting versus this person is, you know, they just happened to grab bread from a grocery store. And it's kind of like, okay. And I think in terms of journalism education, going back to it, we learn about data, but we don't learn how to use that data. Exactly what you said, Julian. We don't learn how to get this number and then get this set and then realize that, oh, there's a story here. How do we use that story to tell that information? And in telling that story, it is subjective. And I think that I have this battle with objectivity versus subjectivity all the time, but it's okay to be a little bit subjective for me. And I think that that's how you get that information out, because if you just give somebody a number, they're going to be like, okay, that's 84%. But if you show them, this is what 84% of people are going through every single day in regard to the pandemic. This is what so many people are going through in terms of the protests. This is how many Black Americans are, you know, fill in your favorite, you know, statistic here. But I think that that's where like education needs to step in, and they need to give people the tools to be able to tell a story and to think critically about those numbers and to entice their audience as well and inform them.
I always like to go to the story that my father used to tell me when he worked for the Postal Service, and he became a supervisor in the Milwaukee office. And there was another supervisor who was also a Black man, but there were only two of them. So if one of them was out sick, the management could say, well, half of the Black people we have working here didn't come to work today.
Yeah.
But there were only two. So you have to get the context of what the numbers really mean before you use them.
We're getting lots of questions in the chat. I just want to bring a couple of them in. So one person, Navina, basically, this was a comment. She said the media coverage was ridiculous on the State Street situation that you were talking about, Angiana. But someone, Gina, actually asked about what happens when the statistics are used to skew the real life implications.
I'm not sure. What's an possible example of that? What do you mean?
Gina, can you unmute and ask that, please?
So I'll use COVID-19 as an example, which is in the chat too. So for instance, COVID-19, we know that African Americans are definitely impacted more by COVID-19, but the way, that's data, right? We know that the stats show that, we know that that's true, but the way it's skewed is that it's almost African Americans' fault. It's our fault. And it's being reported that if only Black people would not live together, if only Black folks would do something different, perhaps they would not be the ones having COVID at a more alarming rate. Well, we know that it's really based on some of the systemic challenges and the systemic racism issues that we're facing in this nation. And so I'm saying, yes, they're using data to do the reporting, but they're skewing it, right? So that it's almost blaming and shaming Black folks when it's really the systemic oppression that has led us to this place that we are. So housing, transportation, etc.
That's a good point. Now, I'll add something from Memphis, because we've had to deal with this, especially here, because we're a city that's about 63% African American. In our home county, Shelby County, it's about 54% African American. And we index higher for both cases and deaths for African Americans in our city and our community for African Americans. But we pointed out repeatedly in our stories that because African Americans are indexing higher for comorbidities, for diabetes, for kidney disease, for high blood pressure, for obesity in Memphis, Tennessee, and in Shelby County. That is one reason the rate of COVID deaths and COVID transmission is higher for those communities. So we try to do that on a consistent basis to explain the reasons behind the number of African Americans who have COVID-19 and who died from COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
And it also brings up the question about communication with the community and helping them understand how they're affected and why they should wear a mask and other things, which is a county responsibility. We really made that point very early on with the community.
I want to say that one good thing that's come out of the pandemic and COVID-19 is that these disparities and things that you see on this tree have now been brought to light to people who never really thought about it before. They got involved in the protests and the demonstrations, but beyond that, they're now looking at the comorbidities, the lack of adequate health care, the lack of educations, and hopefully they're saying, oh, I didn't know this was happening, and now I want to be involved in changing it.
Yeah. I think also to bring in the point that was brought up about like all of these things are finally being brought up, but they're not mentioning the factors. And so when we look at this tree, it shows all of these different factors and these different branches. We don't have control over these things as Black Americans. These are things that are just kind of like when we're born, this is what we have to endure. We have to figure out how to navigate within these systems. And so, and to connect it to the comment in the chat about data journalism, like we're taught the most basic bones of journalism. We're not taught about here's the data, here's the story behind it. And so I think for myself, I want to pursue academia in terms of like Black political journalism. So I'm doing a lot of reading in terms of like, what are some systemic factors and what are some racist ideologies that are just part of our society today? But people don't know that. People don't know about mass incarceration and how it affects Black people. And they don't know about high poverty rates and redlining and all these different disparities that affect people. And so when they see a Black person or Black families living together in close quarters, they don't see that systemic part of it that caused them to happen. And then they put the blame on Black Americans. And a lot of this also, I feel like, comes from white journalists and white reporters who want to understand it and they understand the most basic level of it, but then they don't have the resources or they don't know where to go next to look for it. And I know that we talked a little bit more about like follow-up stories. It's okay for you to report on something as simple as this, but then touch up on that after and talk about the systemic factors that affect this issue. When we look at mass incarceration, like, you know, people are in prisons and in jail and they're incarcerated. How does that affect them? And then what if they get released? Are they exposed to it? Were they being tested? All these different things. And so I think in terms of journalism education, going back to it, you have to be able to teach your journalism students what they need to be successful, but also to think critically and think bigger than just about, oh, here's this fact, here's this person. I'm also from Wisconsin, so I say "ope" a lot. Sorry in advance. But looking at all of these different factors and seeing how they play a role in the everyday things that Black Americans do. And I said it before too, like Black people are seen as a problem, not a product of a problem. And if you fail to recognize that, then again, you're doing a disservice by reporting on issues that affect Black Americans because you're not touching on every other system that affects the one thing that you're reporting on.
That's a good point. And I want to just make one point now because it's really relevant now with the return to school. And in many cases, that means a return to virtual school. And that it has a disparate impact on African-American communities, particularly in places like Memphis and Milwaukee, where you have poor communities where people don't have laptops or iPads, and in some cases may not even have broadband access in their home. And we're expecting them to learn virtually when in fact they don't have the equipment to do so. And they have a father or mother or grandmother who has to work every day. They don't have someone who can stay at home with them and teach them. They don't have the equipment. They don't have the ability to have an adult teach them. And yet we expect them not to fall behind as virtual school continues. That's nuts. It's absolutely nuts.
And that's a story that we're going to have to follow through the end of the year and into next year. And let's hope we see stories from education reporters who are looking into this. We can't just let this go. It's a situation that a lot of people don't think about.
Right.
We bring it up so they do think about it.
Absolutely. And Joanne and I used to cover schools, and so this would be right up our alley. And Definitely, it's definitely a concern that I've had as well as I look at people who don't have Wi-Fi, who don't, have somebody there to sit there and make sure they do their homework and make sure they do their learning. In the
I got a kick the other day out of a story in the New York Times that talked about the growth of learning pods in communities where parents who are probably well-heeled are hiring tutors and others and setting up these pods to have kids get individualized, customized tutoring and learning. Well, that's great if you have the money to do so, but in many communities, getting a laptop, getting learning period is a challenge, much less having a learning pod. So it really does hammer home the point about the widening gap in achievement is going to widen even further.
I had the same reaction to that story, Mark. In the chat, Claire Bittner says, I have a journalism degree from 20 years ago. This is kind of going back, still talking about data, that did not require more than one semester of statistics from a Big Ten university. I have hoped the new trend for big data jobs had transferred to journalism school, but it is not true. I also wonder if journalism school today includes digital media and platforms, or if it's still focused on TV and print. I mean, I know for sure that the University of Missouri has digital media, and so I'm not quite sure about everybody else, but I'm sure the schools have made that transition.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We have a lot of, so just to break down our like J School curriculum, everybody comes into the J School taking like an introductory, here's how you report, here's kind of the basics of forming a story. They touch on framing and the use like of language and word choice and how it does frame, but they don't touch a little bit more on like that implicit bias of like what you may already experience can frame what you report on. And then once you get into the J School, everyone takes this introductory course. And so our J School is broken up by reporting and then strategic communication. Public relations is a totally separate school, but a lot of people who do StratCom may also end up in PR. And so then everyone in this introductory course takes the same kind of, here's how you write a press release. We get this like super, and it's actually a very advanced course. We get all this information. We basically have to write like all these 24-hour like breaking news things. We have to write all these headlines, learn how to interview. And it's very particular because they give us the information. And so if we stray from that information, or if we happen to put something else that's not in there, they'll know and they'll be like, all right, so here's what you did. You said this and it wasn't in the information. Here's an example of like, you got to make sure you read and you do the information and you do the research and things like that. And then we have reporting, which is just kind of go out and cover these different things. You get to pick something to report on. We have a video class, which is focused on documentaries and like longer form videos. We have an audio class, which focuses on podcasting. I don't think we have a digital platform class, but we do have a TV broadcast class that meets once like in the fall semester every year. And so that focuses on the kind of TV aspect. But I think that the digital journalism, like the social media part of it, that is part of digital media, isn't really touched on as much. We do have that data journalism, but it was a very small percentage of it. And I think they're still trying to develop and figure out what's the best way to do it, because they do it between reporting and StratCom. And so how do you use data in StratCom compared to how do you use data in reporting? I think they could do a little bit better job of doing data in reporting, but I think that they're just trying to lump it all together. And so in that, you get a little bit of a disparity, because when you try to lump everyone together, you're missing so many more things outside of just the spectrum.
You mentioned that Lynn Iakenta said database journalism is unfortunately taught most often at the graduate level. And at workshops, it needs to work down to the undergrad level. So you're saying there's a little bit, but we need to have more of it, right, Angiana?
Yeah, and I can't speak from the StratCom perspective, because I think that there's a lot of focus on data in StratCom, just because in terms of like numbers and audience. But I think that that data component to reporting could be really focused on a lot more. And I think that there needs to be more workshopping in terms of what it looks like to be a reporter now, because they don't talk about markets and they don't talk about when looking for a job, what are things that you need to look for. And so, for example, if you go out to some rural place in Nebraska, your reporting is going to look a whole lot different if you're reporting on Milwaukee, but you both have the same amount of experience. And so what disparities in that are you going to encounter? Say, for example, you're a Black person reporting in rural Nebraska. How is that going to affect your ability to do your job? Say you're a Black person reporting in Milwaukee. What types of things that you saw that can help you kind of do your reporting job. And so also speaking to the grad school experience, that is a very valid point, that you kind of touch more on your niche and what you're interested in later after you get that basic. But sometimes it's kind of like you're paying thousands of dollars to be taught how to write, and then that's it. And so there needs to be more of that incorporation of, okay, you're completely ready to report on whatever it is you want to report on. You're aware of all these different systems, and you don't have to go into like the deep philosophies of every system that affects people in America. But I think that there does need to be more of that acknowledgement of, we live in a white, cisgender, patriarchal society, and you're reporting on these things. You have to address those things. And I think that because they aren't doing as much of that until it gets brought up in a question, until someone has a question in lecture, until someone reports on something and they're like, all right, wait a minute, pump your brakes. Now I have to kind of educate you a little bit on it, but it doesn't do students a lot of service if everyone has that information.
David, one of our co-hosts, said, I feel like it's not just statistics. A stat may get the headline, but then the author or reporter makes up their opinion for why the stat is happening versus diving into discussion with people about why this may be.
Now, statistics are difficult to report on anyway, and they always require interpretation of what they mean. So it's too bad, Angiana, that you don't get enough statistics and data instruction in colleges. I can't tell you why, because I'm not an academic. But as far as the new medias are concerned, the social medias and the platforms that have now become news operations per se, they are developing and evolving so quickly that I don't think academia can keep up with it.
Yeah.
So you're probably ahead of them than some of your professors when it comes to dealing with these various platforms. But when it comes to dealing with the statistics, I think we have to look beyond them. And that's why I always say that you have to be a savvy consumer of information and about news and about media. So if you see a statistic that you say, oh my goodness, 87% of this do this, think to yourself, that's a big number. What does that really mean? And if you're a concerned citizen and you want to find out, you'll dig a little bit deeper and go into whoever the reference is that came up with this statistic and find out for yourself. But that's a lot of work. And most people in the day-to-day, when they're consuming media, don't have time and just don't do it.
And I would just counsel too, good points, and to have a healthy amount of skepticism when you hear statistics from government entities. And I use an example particularly of the Justice Department and William Barr and the U.S. attorneys have launched this Operation Legend, which is named after a kid in Kansas City who was killed. I think it's been launched in Milwaukee, Cleveland, as well as Memphis most recently. And we're actually going to look at the numbers of those they have arrested in Operation Legend and try and look specifically at whether they're going after violent criminals or are they going after folks who were found with drugs or found with a weapon, and really explain what's happening behind this initiative that was launched with great fanfare in the middle of a campaign. Because I really want to have our journalists be skeptical about why things are happening and look at statistics behind these programs to find out what's really going on.
Well, the biggest thing you can question during a campaign season is, why is there such a brouhaha over the post office?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We hear all this 6-7 months ago, but suddenly there's a new postmaster general who's slowing things down and mailboxes are being removed. And you have to ask, what's up with that at this particular time?
Right.
And I think the media asked enough questions that now we're going to have some hearings about it. So that's also the role of the media, to ask the questions when they see something that doesn't seem quite right and keep asking the questions until they get the answers.
It was amazing how those questions came up from the media and others. And then Nancy Pelosi announced that Congress was going to come back to consider rolling back some of those plans. And immediately the Postmaster General, Louis DeJoy, decided, well, we don't need to do this stuff till after the election.
Right.
It was a 5-alarm emergency before. Now it's not an emergency at all.
Exactly.
It kind of tells you it was all political from the get-go.
Absolutely. Everything is so political these days, it seems. We have one of our former anchor reporters here in Milwaukee who moved to Portland, Laura Stevenson, says, can you talk more about the impact of the 24-hour news cycle on the coverage of systemic racism? I think that, I mean, systemic racism, well, by the name is systemic. And so I think it's, kind of, it's difficult to kind of break it down just with systemic racism, but maybe.
Well, I'm sorry, Vivian, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Go ahead.
Because news is now 24/7, the people who are managing it and want to get the information out want you to do it as quickly as you can. And that doesn't lend itself to looking deeply. It lends itself to looking fast. And you have to look more deeply into stories, even though your deadline may be 10 minutes from now. You may just have to do a short story and then come back and do another story in a half an hour and then come back and do another story tomorrow. But it's changed the way we operate because we are under this constant pressure to get it out, get it first, get it fast. But our responsibility as good journalists is to get it right.
Yeah, I want to just pick up on that and talk about the protests for a bit, because I think in some cases, when you're covering a Black Lives Matter protest and you see a few or a dozen people throwing items, breaking windows, or doing something that is construed violent, and you report that, and particularly this happens on television, you have to step back and look more broadly at what's happening. And you need to confirm that most of the folks were peaceful. And while there may have been a small portion of folks who were quote unquote violent or broke windows or threw bottles at officers, most of the folks there were peaceful. And that's important to always remember in that 24-hour news cycle as you're covering something, that there's always reason to come back to add additional context and to broaden the lens on what really happened.
Well, and then I would add that not just the 24-hour news cycle, but the addition of social media makes it go even faster. I can't even imagine reporting with social media because I left before it got, really, really popular. So that
There's also a key advantage of social media when it comes to covering something like a protest, and we've seen it with our reporting staff here in Memphis. When you can capture something happening on the scene, whether it's protesters breaking a window or cops being overly aggressive with protesters, and you capture it on social media and there's video, there's no way the cops can deny it. They have to acknowledge it, and that becomes part of the core reporting process. And we've encouraged our people to post those videos, immediately put them online, and use them as part of the reporting process.
I always say that every tool has its strength, and so any tool that you can use can help, and sometimes tools can manipulate as well. But I choose to look at the positive side. Okay, what can we get from this? And so,
yeah. And something I saw on social media this summer, I think, and part of it is the lumping of all Black Americans into this one group and assuming that we're all the same, living the same experience. And part of it is there was this new conversation surrounding like photography at protests and the protection of Black people at protests, because Black youth were going missing for days at a time. And people were sharing their pictures on social media, wanting to make sure that they were okay, but they were at protests. And so then this new conversation came around. Okay, so if we take pictures as journalists just to capture a moment at a protest, are we putting this person's life in danger? And then what is the outcome of that? And then do we, as journalists, are we still supposed to be objective and just snap the picture? Or do we go about getting the picture a different way? And in speaking about social media, everything is so fast. And part of it being so fast is that it's like, there's so much information going on at so many different times. And so if there's one wrong fact in a tweet that gets, viral, then it's like that fact is spread so widely. And you don't know how many people screenshot and how many people share and send a link and all these different things. And so then you like kind of increase the false information on social media. And part of it is with social media, everyone thinks that they're a doctor, everyone thinks that they're a sociologist, everyone has this like sense of like everyone is educated about something on social media. And so part of it is kind of like respecting that they think that they know what they're talking about, but then also acknowledging that there are bots out there. And that's a whole nother conversation, talking about bots and false information. But there's so much information out there that everything gets spread, and we don't know how much of it is really true and how much of it is fake. And then we get into the whole fake news conversation, and something gets checked, and then not to bring the president in the conversation, but like then we get this whole thing of I wasn't incorrect and you censored me and all these different things. And so social media is a whole another monster on its own. But I think that in regard to like Black Americans, it really is. It's powerful, but then it also is super detrimental to the well-being of us entirely.
Let's talk a little bit about crime. And I want David to bring up that homicide, that crime statistic graphic that I showed you guys earlier. And in particular, because we've had in Chicago, you know, there was crime on Michigan Avenue and crime that has, you know, been taking place throughout our cities and throughout the country. And there's always this Black on Black crime. You never hear white on white crime. And let's talk about what the origins of that and the detriment that does to a community. And this graphic really shows 2018's crime statistics, expanded homicide data, and it looks at and I just pulled out these particular numbers. With white victims, there were a total of 3,315 white victims in 2018. The offenders there were 2,677 offenders, or 81% were white offenders on white victims. With Black victims, 2,925, 2,800 were were Black offenders. 2,800 were Black offenders. Okay, I heard myself. Anyway, bottom line, homicide is a crime of proximity.
Yep.
Black on Black crime, everybody, that's the retort when you have, you know, when you have protests, when you have police brutality, and people are saying, well, you didn't protest Black on Black crime. What are your thoughts about that?
So the main thing to know about this is that this has been the case for decades. Probably going back to the 1950s and the 60s, where murder happens typically between people who know each other. And it typically happens between people from the same race, as this chart illustrates. And a lot of times when particularly politicians are talking about Black on Black crime or urban crime, using it to justify something like Operation Legend or some other initiative, it is plainly a dog whistle to some in the community to be afraid, very afraid of people who don't look like them. That is it, plain and simple.
And how can we change that, Mark?
In terms of the media or in terms of our politicians?
A little bit of both.
Yeah.
Can the media be more responsible and not say Black on Black crime anymore? Can they stop using that term? Can they state? I've heard other people state, you know, that it's a crime of proximity, but you still see Black on Black crime and not white on white crime.
Yeah, it's a problem, and I think many organizations, mine included, seldom use that term. Because again, in Memphis, we're a city that's 60% African American, a high poverty rate. So what do you expect when it comes to the statistics on murder? It's gonna typically be people who live in proximity to each other. So we've in our own shop, we don't use that Black on Black term. I can't speak for other stuff.
Well, when I was in the newsroom, we often had discussions about how you describe someone who is wanted for a crime. The police will send you a description of the person who's wanted, and it could fit 100 people, usually male, usually pretty vague, and usually black. But that's the description they sent you. So we would always wonder among ourselves whether or not we should use the word black in the description. And it sort of depended on what the crime was, what the person they're looking for actually looked like. I mean, there have been plenty of times when a police sketch was so vague that you couldn't really identify anybody from that particular police sketch.
Right.
And Mark's right. It's a crime of proximity. You commit these crimes where close to where you are, because that's the area in which you're familiar. So I don't think I have ever used that phrase in my reporting. But when I did report stories that dealt with crime, if it was necessary to give that as a descriptor of the person being sought, I would use it. But if it wasn't necessary, I didn't use it.
Yeah, our policy on that is it has to be part of the detailed description of a suspect in a case in order to use race, whether it's white or black.
Yeah.
We don't just use it in a general description, although cops typically will tell you that a person is black, 6'5", and has gray hair. Well, that could apply to 50% of people in a particular neighborhood in Memphis. Well, 6'5" probably wouldn't, but 6 foot even would definitely apply.
Well, but then there are the various shades of black people.
Yes.
So, but how are you going to say that a person who's one shade of black in descriptor and another person who's much lighter, who the cop may not have thought was black, so they didn't put that in the description. So because we have such variety in our African ancestry and our families, that sometimes they get it wrong.
Yeah, in fact, all four of us represent 4 different shades of black. And earlier, Danielle Sill asked a question when we were talking about the Hurricane Katrina pictures. Would it be preferred to not state race at all in headlines or in newspapers? Or if they are going to state race, then do it for all? What would be better?
I think you have to state race when it's relevant. And in the case of those photos, it's not relevant because you can see plainly in the photo, well, in most cases, you can see plainly in photos what race someone is. Sometimes you can't really tell, but in most cases you can see it. But in many cases, it's not relevant anyway. It's just not relevant.
Right.
And I also think of this in terms of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, with those 2 photos that we looked at, it's not relevant.
Yeah.
It should have said, here's a man waist deep in water bringing materials out of the flood. And here are 2 more people waist deep in water bringing materials out of the flood.
Right.
Right.
It was not a necessary word to use to describe him. And the other word, white people, wasn't used to describe them. It wasn't necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to like what I was saying about teaching implicit biases. Like race is everything, but it isn't everything. And so when we talk about black on black crime, like I've never really used that. But then within black on black crime, there could be a million reasons as to whatever happened. But then when we see, if we're going to use white on white crime, they report it as mother snaps and murders children. You know what I mean? They use that victimization of this happened to this person, not that the black people are still part of that, like this systemic oppression. Like they don't ever make that distinction. They still put the problem on the black people. We're in charge. We're responsible for our actions. But then everyone else, oh no. You know, and this also speaks to like the photography and when they use like mugshots or misleading photos for people who are black and who are in some way related to crime, but then white people who either, you know, are also part of crime, but they use this like church photo, this community gathering photo, this graduation photo, and then you're already implying that one person is more innocent than another person. And even in situations where the black person is a child, like the victimization and also just the perception that black people are just, they're always going to be grown, they're always going to be responsible for their actions, that you know, we should be held to the highest standard of the law because we know right from wrong and we know what we're doing, comparison to like white people. And then when you look at those pictures again, you see the same thing. They're both
chest deep in water. That's race has nothing to do with the issue at all. And then for you to bring it up and then not bring it up for another one is just kind of like, okay, so then on this article, are you going to talk about the person being Black and whatever else happened in this person's life? And then in the other article, oh, they're victims of Hurricane Katrina. And just how people automatically see a picture and assume that's something that needs to be addressed in education as well.
Absolutely. We have one question here, or statement, I should say, from Carla Washington. Some media outlets blame their lack of attention to editorial oversight on budget cuts. He says that's not acceptable and they still have to be accountable. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Mark, you know about management. I'll let you go with that. Go ahead.
I would say absolutely. If we just had one person in our room, we have, of course, way more than one person in our newsroom. Our newsroom actually is in our homes right now because we're all working remotely.
Right.
We would still have the responsibility to be fair, accurate, and put things in context. So budget cuts have nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with critical thinking in a newsroom and among editors. And I would say something we haven't talked about much so far, but is very important, is representation in newsrooms, whether it's a broadcast station, a digital operation, or a newsroom. To the extent that you have representation, you have a more robust discussion about these kind of issues and stories. And you may have had somebody discussing that caption on that AP photo who said, hey, wait a minute, why are we saying this? We should think about this more before we do this. And you also have more authentic voices in your stories because you have a more diverse newsroom where people are bringing their experiences into play every single day.
Yeah, a lot of people think it's really important to have Black people on camera in television operations. And it is important. And the numbers have gone up and down. There's usually a percentage of how many Black faces you see and how many white faces you see in a television news operation. But what's really important are the people behind the camera, the people who are making the decisions about what stories are going to be told and how they are going to be told. And that's where we have to ask the questions of these news operations. Who's making those decisions? And that's where we have to get students like you to learn that once you learn how to be a reporter, now I want you to learn how to be a manager. I want you to learn how to be the person who's making the decisions and making the hiring and firing of the people who will do the reporting, because that's where the real culprit lies. It's behind the camera.
Yeah, and also to the point of representation in newsrooms, I think about this a lot. UW-Madison is predominantly white, and in our J school, we have, I want to say, less than 10 Black students. And so when we think about this idea of educating and attention to things, it isn't always on the Black person to educate, but then we often still feel the need to educate. Because if we sit back and let them do this problematic thing, or we let them sit and say something or assume something, then it's kind of like, you feel automatically not responsible. And so then from the student perspective, you get this whole conversation around, we got to educate in our classrooms, our newsrooms, everywhere, and it gets so exhausting. And so then it falls on the managers and then, the people in charge who make these decisions to know right from wrong, to know these different things, and then educate their staff, their reporters, their whomever on, these different things. And so we don't get that lack of attention. Oh, I didn't know, because ignorance is not an excuse, and so, yeah, I think it all just comes down to educating. Oh, sorry, I was reading the newest comment that came in. The increasing numbers of journalists of color in J schools and newsrooms is so important, but I think that it also, you don't want to tokenize them, because I think that in being so few, we often get tokenized and you're this person and you're this person and we know you and we know that you're always going to say something, and then that really falls back on their mental health, feeling like they have to educate and be tired and be on all the time. But I think that it's really reaching out to the resources. There's so many media organizations across this nation, y'all. There's so many people, like NABJ is like a huge organization and there's so many members nationwide. Reach out to your resources and ask them, go to virtual career fairs, go and reach out to people in different communities, and not necessarily grab them, but also, talk to them and get their experiences and also just have them there and support them as well.
Yeah, you're talking about NABJ, and that has always been, the thing with me. You want to find Black journalists, go to the National Association of Black Journalists, and they can help you. And we're still not doing that. And part of the decision making, I think, comes from this statement and question from Jacqueline Glass, who says, why does the media put Black crime on the front page of the newspaper with a picture? Then when white people commit a crime, no pictures and little information of unlawful acts, not on the front page of the newspaper. Their story is written as if it is innocent. And why is that? And I think it kind of goes back to, the decisions of what's being put on the front page or what's being put, when a story leads a newscast. Would you agree with that?
It all goes back to whoever is managing that news operation.
Yes.
What they think and what they believe. And have they had the honest conversations in their newsroom with people who have different points of view? You have to, whatever you see on the front page, whatever you see on the opening page of a website, whatever you see on the evening news, it's all because a manager made a decision to put it there. So you have to question, who are these managers?
Yeah, I would agree with that and point out that no reporter alone, whether it's a newspaper, a digital site, or a broadcast station, makes a decision alone to do a story and put it at the top of the block on the broadcast or on the front page or on the homepage of a website. It is a collective decision made by several people usually, and the issue of how you frame a story is very important. So from a standpoint of a crime story, in our organization, we don't do a lot of crime stories. We do stories about safety topics that try and look at larger trends that are happening in the community. And we don't write about every single shooting. We don't write about every single incident because it doesn't rise to the level of a major story. But the issue is putting things in some degree of context and writing about them so the community understands better what's happening with the range of crime in an area.
And that's why I want to applaud the Commercial Appeal for making you the executive editor, Mark, because we know that this does not happen in your newspaper. At least you will answer to it.
Or I'll get blamed for it if it does happen, and that's happened before.
One of our previous presenters, Dr. Pat McManus, says what is not discussed is the impact of biogenetics on African Americans in historical trauma. Is that a story?
That's a big subject and a big complex issue, and I applaud Dr. McManus for bringing that up. But that's something that could be covered in lots and lots of stories, and it takes a lot of work and dedication to cover that kind of story. It's going to involve data and statistics and historical context, and you can't turn that story in a day. You can't turn that story in 4 hours, which is about all that people in broadcast news have. You can't turn that story in a week, but you can start to take little pieces of it and report on it and say, we're going to do more on this as we go along, if your management will let you do that. It would be great to have those discussions on those particular issues, but it's hard when it comes to the news business.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Mark.
In Memphis, we've got a movement here, and I think it's probably happening elsewhere, certainly in Milwaukee, other cities like Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Detroit, where there's a group called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And increasingly what we're hearing from the advocates and experts, both university professors as well as others, is that a child who is raised in an environment where they see violence consistently is more apt to become numb to that violence and therefore be more susceptible to being lured into a gang, for example. If someone doesn't intervene in their life and help them understand that that's not the right way to go. So we have to keep that in mind when we're writing about cases involving juveniles, for example, in crime, that they may have been subjected throughout their life to a series of incidents that have made them numb to violence. And that plays into maybe what happened to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think also speaking to that too, something that I'm seeing more as an increasing trend is like the prevalence of mental health resources for Black journalists, because I think like exactly what you said, Mark, like we don't realize how heavy a lot of the stuff is until it gets to the breaking point, and then we're like crying, bawling, whatever the situation is. And I think that now, like something the NABJ convention was just recently, but I really appreciated having the conversations that focus on mental health and the importance of it for Black journalists, because a lot of times, like 24/7, we're go, 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 go. Where's the story? Got to go do this. I got to interview. But we don't take time to sit and think about, wow, and even just like us being in a pandemic and in the middle of all this racial, uppress, like we're really going through a lot, and we need that time to sit and think about it. And in addition to generational trauma and what we don't even know happened physically, but we're feeling it, and it's just part of us, and it's our natural reaction to it. And so I think that newsrooms, schools, everywhere needs to just start incorporating that space, that option, that something to support Black journalists who are going through a lot of this stuff.
It's something I've encouraged other young journalists and people who are more seasoned like Joanne and me, is to have a personal kind of board of directors. So to what Anjiana is saying, that when you are going through something and you don't have anybody in your newsroom who you feel comfortable talking to, and that's the case in a lot of cases, you need to have others you can talk to and talk through these issues, because they can be debilitating if you don't talk about them, if you don't get some sense of counsel from others who have been through them before.
Well,
it can also be very difficult. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It can also be very difficult in news operations if you were the only one, or if there are only two of you. But it's really difficult when you were the only one. And who do you turn to? And that's why NABJ is very valuable for people to make connections and find people to talk with. If you have a local Black journalist organization, join it, because that's another group of people with whom you can speak. Because it can be really lonely in the newsroom if all this is happening around you, and I'm not even talking about what's happening in the larger society, but dealing with the culture of a news operation, and you're the only Black person there, it can be difficult.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, when I was reporting and anchoring, going from Alexandria, Louisiana, Tyler, Texas, Battle Creek, Michigan to Milwaukee, every year I would go to NABJ, and it would just be so cathartic for me, because I could see people who were having the same experiences that I was having, and I knew that I was not alone. And Muriel Smith Gross writes in here, do Black journalists mentor Black student reporters? And the answer is a resounding yes, because I know I know Mark and Joanne do, and I'm sure Anjiana is getting that from being the NABJ representative. So absolutely. Yes. Earlier, Laura Stevenson, also, we were talking about two sides of the story, and I did not get to ask this question from her. It says, is it really a journalistic principle that there are two sides of every story? Isn't that framework itself too limited? But I think you guys have kind of woven that into some of your answers, that you get interviews and information from a variety of different people, including now people on social media too.
So I'm going to take a stab at that and use a current story as an example to point out that there aren't always two sides to a story. So we saw the issue with Kamala Harris earlier this week and late last week, when there were discussions, and even President Trump was discussing whether she was born in the United States, again attempting to kind of paint her as a foreigner because she has a parent from Jamaica and one from India. And we know in that instance, there are not two sides to that story. She was born in Oakland, California, and we can say that very plainly. But some organizations, I think including PBS and one other that I can't remember, actually reported this and called it a theory, a conspiracy theory. Well, no, it's not a conspiracy theory. It is an outright lie, and we have to call it what it is. And I think that kind of authentic reporting makes us more credible as journalists. We don't have to kind of carry forth the notion that there are two sides to the story. There are not two sides to the story. We know she was born in Oakland. We know she's eligible to run for vice president. Move on to another topic.
Yeah. And speaking of lying, we had a a question come in earlier before our webinar started. How do you spin an interview when you and your audience know that the interviewee is lying? Now, I know we don't spin an interview, so but we kind of talked about that, when we were preparing for this. So what do you think about that?
Well, the good journalist isn't doing the spinning. It's the interviewee who's trying to spin whatever the situation is or whatever the facts are. And you have to go into a conversation with somebody or an interview with somebody with the facts. Sometimes you have to go in and know more than they do about the issue you're discussing, so that if they give you an answer that you believe is inaccurate, you can ask them another way. You just have to keep asking the questions until they give you the answer that you know is true because it's based on the facts. People who are being interviewed by media folks very often don't want to say exactly what's going on or what the situation is. So they avoid it and they answer you in ways, euphemisms or sometimes half-truths. But it's a journalist's job to keep asking. Just keep asking those questions until they either have to answer them or they get up and walk out of your interview.
Right. I think that's the power of a follow-up question that was never on better display than in a recent interview. I think it was Axios did with President Trump about 3 weeks ago. And the reporter asked a lot of how and why questions that drew Trump out on various issues. And of course, he got flustered essentially because he was literally trying to move around back and forth without answering questions, and the reporter forced him into a position of answering questions. So I think the power of the follow-up is important there. But it's also important for journalists to understand that when you're interviewing someone, particularly someone in power, and they come in and they say that, I want to limit the set of questions to these topics, that is a big red flag that they're going to try and spin you. The other thing that they tend to do, and we often would tell people, well, let's not do the interview if that's the case. They will say to you, we want to be off the record first. Well, no, we're not going to be off the record, whether it's a editorial board interview, an interview for a story. We're on the record. At the very end, if you want to go off the record, we'll entertain that thought at the end, but we're going to do an on-the-record interview on this topic because it's important to get you on the record and not start off the record and have you spin us and then go on the record later.
Yeah. Nobody can put a conversation or an interview off the record except the reporter.
Right.
The person who's being interviewed can't do that. But like Mark said, if after you've done your formal interview, if you want to have a little sidebar chat, that's acceptable. But when the camera's on and when the microphone's open, it's all on the record. And if you don't want to answer it, don't answer it. And if you didn't think you were going to be able to give truthful answers, don't do the interview.
So speaking of, we kind of talked about we're in the middle of the end of the DNC and the beginning of the RNC next week. And so I've already started saying, I've been seeing them, but the ads this morning that I saw on television, were anti-Joe Biden. And so the Republicans are really, already starting. And so speaking of, politicians are the ones who always are trying to spin and decide what topic they're going to tackle, if you will. And so how do you get ready for this season, especially now with the Democratic ticket? We have history in the making. History has been made with Kamala Harris being the first Black to be a vice presidential pick and first Asian American. How do you make sure that we get truthful reporting, that we don't have skewed statistics, because they're going to be throwing around so many statistics?
So let me take a step at that first, if you don't mind, because Kamala Harris is a lot of firsts. You mentioned the first African American, the first East Asian person to run for vice president. She also is the first HBCU grad as well. And I think she may be the first person from California to ever make it this far on a ticket that's actually favored to win the presidency. And I think in some ways, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and other organizations have led the way in this regard. And that is that they're reporting on issues about Kamala Harris that go way beyond the ones you would expect. You expect them to look at her record as an attorney general, her record as a district attorney in San Francisco. You expect those kind of things. But I've also read stories about people from the New York Times actually talk to folks from other HBCUs about her. Some of her sorority members from Alpha Kappa Alpha about their feelings about her candidacy and their willingness to support her candidacy both through fundraising and campaigning. They've also talked to the Indian community about what her candidacy means for particularly young girls who see in her someone who is a role model and a hero to them. So I think that the reporting has to start, of course, with issues, but it should go way beyond that and look at some other things about people like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden and their character. And the same thing for Trump and Pence. And we've had 4 years to see that. So there's not a lot we have to dig for the two of them, but we should continue to do that kind of reporting.
Well, I think it was probably when Kamala Harris made her speech the other night, a lot of reporters were running to Google to find out what's Alpha Kappa Alpha and what's an HBCU.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people in America who don't know what
you're absolutely right.
organizations are. So in that sense, we are educating America about things that they have not learned about. So, it seems like we're digging too deep into her, but she is helping us learn about things that we didn't know about before. So thank you for Kamala for bringing all that up.
Exactly. Well, I know in her speech she said, I like to thank my Alpha Kappa Alpha sisters and my D9 organizations, and they don't know the Divine Nine, which are, the 9 African-American fraternities and sororities. And so there are 9 of us. And so but everybody is really excited that she's at least raising the dialogue about those things as well. And I'm sure, Anjiana, from a student perspective, looking at, the VP being Kamala, the VP candidate being Kamala Harris, how does that, how do you look at that as a student and then a journalism student, a Black student, and a student?
I think he gave way back, seems like it was a year ago now. I think there was a lot of conversation when she was running for the just as a presidential candidate. There are all these conversations, one about PWI versus HBCU, and I'm like, here we go again. We have the same conversation every semester. And I think that part of it is, and this isn't really having to do with the media, but this is that division between so many people. We're not just Black people. It's, oh, you went to HBCU versus the PWI. Oh, you were this versus this. And I think that in some way it is really enlightening to see the media kind of like dig into that a little bit and get that education out there. But it also kind of like shelters us more and it separates us more from like the Black community, because then you get all of these different arguments and all these different things and the media's bringing it up and then all these different things. But I think that it is a really huge deal that she's making this history. And so we have to acknowledge that. And I think that also in part of that separation between the Black community, we have to acknowledge when the media is kind of like poking us a little bit, and we have to acknowledge when the media is like saying or doing things to make us kind of feel some type of way. And so then as a Black journalism student and then being part of NABJ and all these different things, I just think that it's really important that we like stick to that community, because that's going to be so important, because they're going to find ways to separate us and to put us in boxes in so many different ways. And I think that and part of intersectionalities is acknowledging that there's so many more just beyond those. Like, yes, first Black, first Southeast Asian, but then also like that is who she is. And so let's not break them all down and make them, this is her as this person, this is her as this person. Let's take her as she is, and then that'll send a message too in the Black community in terms of like, you're okay to be yourself. You don't have to use your Blackness in this one way. You don't have to use this one part of your identity in this one way. Bring 100% of you to every situation.
Anjiana, I think as a budding reporter, Anjiana, you have to tell the people watching us, what does HBCU stand for and what does PWI stand for?
That is very true.
Say we need to educate our audience, because
HBCU
stands for Historically Black College or University, and then a PWI stands for a predominantly white institution.
Yes.
Mark and I went to a predominantly white institution, and so did
Yes.
you.
So did I.
All of us did. All of us did. It's 12:59, and one thing that I did not mention earlier when I introduced our panelists is that Joanne Williams is going to have to leave us at 1 o'clock. And so, will you be able to stay?
I will be able to stay a while, yes.
Oh, perfect. Good. Well, then
I don't have to go back, which now is, I also work for United Way of Greater Milwaukee and Waukesha County. So I'm sneaking a little time away from there. So
Well, we thank the United Way for lending you us. So we had a question, and I think I shared this with you guys the other day, from a Greendale Health Department intern. And she said, when reporting data on racial disparities in health outcomes or social determinants of health, how can I make sure that the way it's reported doesn't reinforce stereotypes? For example, if there is lower educational attainment among Black or African American community members compared to whites, how can I report those numbers in a way that illustrates all the factors playing into that result, such as racism in school discipline, less funding for schools in minority neighborhoods, and barriers to access higher education? We kind of touched on a little bit of this earlier in some of our talking about the pandemic, but I promised that I was going to ask that question, and I wanted to ask it at this time.
I'll take a quick stab at that because it comes up often with us when I hear from PR people who ask a similar question to that. And I always tell them that do two things. One, in the initial press release, however we get that press release, make sure it includes some additional context about the community you're trying to describe when you're seeking us to, when you're wanting us to do a broader story that reflects that context. But also make someone available who can talk about it with authority. And sometimes that's not the PR person. Sometimes, and I love PR people, sometimes that's maybe the director of the program who is the expert on the stats involved or who is the expert on the issue involved. So if you're trying to tell us a story about how breast cancer impacts African American women in Memphis at a greater rate than any other group, give us someone who is an expert on that issue. Don't give us a PR person who is just going to cite facts from a press release.
And when you're looking to tell that story, and when you're looking for those experts, Mark, I always tried to find a Black expert to put in my story.
Yeah.
So a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or whatever the expertise was needed. If I tried to find a Black person who had that expertise, and I would not say, here is Black Dr. X. I would just say, here's Dr. X.
Yeah.
And I think the more and more we do that and become aware that there are people who are experts in their fields that we can call upon, the more it will become the norm of people, of other reporters, going to them for their opinions.
Agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah, I think it goes back. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, as the communications advisor for the Center for Community Engagement and Health Partnerships, I always say, you guys are the content experts. Like, I've learned a little bit along the way, but you all live this. And so you need to be the ones telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
And they're listening to that right now. Brianna?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, I think in addressing stereotypes, there is a little bit of truth to that, and that's what makes it a little bit problematic. But I think that in that, you still have to address those other factors that are part of it. And so when you look at, like with the tree that we saw, there's all these other factors that made it to be what it is. And so when you're doing the reporting, I think if you, bring in those experts who can kind of tell you, all right, this is the meat, this is what's happening, this is what it is. But then also, even if you want to give a little tease about that, like, extra story that you're going to do after, but like bring in that whole factor of all these systemic things, because again, the media portrays Black Americans as in being responsible for every one of our actions, and that's not the case. It's not the truth. And so you'd be like irresponsible if you didn't acknowledge those things. And you don't have to do a full-fledged report, but I think that you have to also acknowledge the little things. Like, if look at the healthcare system. The healthcare system a lot of times doesn't listen to Black people when we speak and when we tell our problems. And so like that's something that you can just put in there and say, well, here's a statistic, here's data. It shows that Black Americans die at XYZ such and such and such. And so you have to incorporate that systemic information a little bit at a time, as much as you can, because then it'll kind of give some validity to that data, because it'll show, well, here's the research, here's the historical background, and here's how it's playing out in real life.
Basher Easter, who's one of our program managers for the All of Us Research program, says, as we are talking about how the media impact the narrative of Black Americans, can you give your thoughts on who else needs to be at the table to impact the narrative of Black Americans? Also, how long do you think it will take to make the true narrative of Black Americans a visible change?
How long? Oh. Like I said, I've been discussing these issues since I started in the news business. But I think who should be at the table? I think obviously Black reporters and Black media professionals should be at the table, but so should people of other ethnic groups be at the table. And we should have open conversations about what gets covered and how it gets covered. And then there should be follow-up accountability to what the people say what they say they're going to do. And I think that's the important part. It's the accountability. You say you're going to do this, did you do it? And it's not always on us to make sure that these things get done. It's on the people who are the decision makers.
I couldn't agree more with what Joanne just said. And I want to add that one group that's often not talked about enough in terms of being at the table to have these discussions are people in the community themselves. That oftentimes newsrooms are viewed as apart from the community, and we don't have a really good way to get community voices both into our coverage, but also have them help us reflect what we cover. And who better to know the community than those who live in the community? So I make it a point to try and get out as much as I can into Memphis. It's been hard lately because of the pandemic. I have to do it all via Facebook Live and Zoom. But you have to, as an editor or as a manager or reporters should be doing it already anyway. And maybe they should do it even more, but you have to get in the community and talk to people, because you're going to hear authentic voices about what's happening in the areas and where they think we fall short. And then we have to act on those questions, act on those comments, and do something with it.
I did a story years ago when I was doing medical reporting about a program that the city was starting in conjunction with a hospital organization. And it was going to benefit young Black mothers, teenage mothers, and young women who were having babies. And this was the whole purpose of this particular program, was to benefit young Black women. And they sent a PR man and a couple of hospital representatives who were all white men to talk about this program. And I listened to it, and we got our questions answered, and we wrote our story. And then I took one of them aside afterwards, and I said, the next time you're going to do a story or give information about the Black community, don't send a bunch of white guys in suits.
And what was their response to that?
They sort of said, oh, we hadn't thought about that. I said, yeah.
And that's the problem. They're not thinking about it. And I think my answer to that, what I think it starts with education, because I realize like elementary, middle, and high school, how they teach history, it completely eliminates the Black narrative. They say slavery happened, let's move on. And it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, wait a second. Let's stay on that topic a little bit. And no one discusses the effects of slavery on people today. And I think that in terms of education, you have to incorporate more of that narrative so people can kind of, even if you don't have to do like a whole, and this is part of it too, people just kind of glance over it and then don't talk about it ever again. You have to start like incorporating how it affects things that aren't just slavery. And so when you look at college, we have like your ethnic requirement, and that's it. Like that's one class, that's 3 credits. You can take it on some random topic involving any other ethnic group, and that's it, and never come in contact with the Black narrative, and that's a problem. And so you have to start incorporating how Black Americans and how all these different systems have failed us into like, not every single course, but you have to start incorporating it so that when people get to the real world and they see, oh wow, they don't listen to Black people in the healthcare industry, that's wild. And it's like, we've been trying to say this for years and y'all haven't been listening. And so I think that it starts with people like incorporating it as early as possible, because then when people get to the college stage of it, there's like little time and room to kind of like slide in all of these systemic problems.
Yeah, remember when I'm sorry, I just want to talk about it again, Vivian. Remember when there was supposed to be a speech given on Juneteenth Day in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Oh, yeah.
And first of all, the people who scheduled the speech, I don't know why they picked Juneteenth Day, if they did it intentionally or if they just didn't know, but they changed it to a different date. But then so many people in America and so many people in Oklahoma didn't know about the Tulsa race riots.
Yep.
It was news to them. So they learned something that wasn't taught in school. The history of Black people in America is long and complicated and rich, and we don't learn it in school as much as we should. But
Well,
here's an example of America learned about that.
like all of America started to learn about that, because the thing is, you know, it's not just, you know, white kids, Asian kids, you know, Hispanic kids, Black kids are not learning this as well. And so we're all kind of a victim of not learning this history as we have gone through our education.
Well, here's the good news about one aspect of this, and that is that Nicole Hannah-Jones project 1619 on literally on slavery and the reasons behind the actual fostering of slavery and how African Americans played into that and the views of African Americans, which won the Pulitzer Prize, is actually, I think, being used as a teaching curriculum program in some cities. So, you know, there's a ready-made plug-and-play way to at least talk about slavery through the lens of 1619, a project that's got many awards and done by, of course, a decorated African-American journalist who got a MacArthur Award, works for the New York Times.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then people can go to the African American History Museum and see a lot more. Take a field trip to the nation's capital and visit that museum along with others.
Then they can come to the National Civil Rights Museum here in Memphis, Tennessee.
That's right, in Memphis.
I've been to that one. A lot of museums throughout the country. We have one person who said, Rebecca Cossack said, it would really be amazing to see the recording of this incredible discussion built into middle school and high school curriculum. So maybe we can direct them to our website when we're done with this, because the recording will be there. One thing that I was going to ask you, and you kind of touched on it a little bit, Mark, when you said bringing the community involved. One of my questions was, you know, what can readers, viewers, and consumers do to help get stories reflected accurately? And it seems like being a part of a focus group or just reaching out to you in general to get some information.
Right, and again, I will be the first to acknowledge that I think we in the media haven't done a good enough job of reaching out, including myself, to the community. But we have to make ourselves available to folks to suggest stories to us. We have to meet them on their own turf by going into the communities and not demanding that people come see us in our newsrooms when we can go back to our newsrooms. And I think then we have to act on those story ideas and show people that we're going to listen and act on their ideas. And that then engenders people to send even more ideas to us. It's also true that when people look at newsrooms, they particularly think of reporters and editors as folks who are inaccessible and hard to reach. So we have to, it's a basic thing, but every time you do a story, at least in a newspaper or online, you should have a way for people to reach you both by email, by phone, and also to find you if you have a Twitter account. And most reporters have a Twitter account. And that's one easy way to engage with a reporter. And reporters and editors have to then be willing to engage with folks who contact them. Even when when they engage with you, it's uncomfortable. Because in many cases, people have long-held grievances against the news media that go back decades. And you have to listen to that. And once you can listen to it and hear people out, they feel a lot better about you and the organization because you listen to them. I've done a lot of that listening over the last 3 years.
I love it. One thing that I wanted to do, we said we were going to kind of touch on this. I reached out to you because I was in news, you're in news, and really I know how the media can shape the Black narrative. But we talked about the other day in our pre-meeting about non-news media. And so commercials, advertising.
Yep.
So talk a little bit about how that kind of weaves into shaping the Black narrative and some of the changes that have taken place, since 2020 has been this crazy year.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at this. I know others want to jump in too. That I think one of the more interesting things about the reckoning has been the degree to which consumer product companies and other service providers have had to acknowledge that they haven't done enough for representation of African American communities. And in some cases, you've got companies that have made wholesale changes in how they have branded products. Think about Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben's Rice, and other products that they've literally had to drop advertising symbols that they probably knew they had to have known they were offensive pre-2020, but only when you had the added pressure of protests and the reckoning that's happening now that they say, we've got to get rid of this. I think one of the good things that's happening too is that some tech companies, as well as some other large organizations, have recognized that their C-suite or their top executive levels and boardrooms are not nearly as diverse as they should be. In some cases, they're almost all white. And that's been a very good thing that they have viewed this is the chance to try and address that inequity. And I think one of the things that they have probably known for a long time that has become more clear to them is that African American spending power is humongous. And if you're not addressing your boardroom diversity concerns and your C-suite level executive concerns and your ability to have promotion and advertising that benefits African American firms and has images of people that are true and representative of the community, you're not doing your job. And you're going to stand to lose some money if you don't do that.
Yes, it's interesting how many advertisers have turned to showing multicultural families, people of mixed ethnicity, people who sometimes you don't know what their ethnicity is, but they're using them to advertise what their product is. Because as you said, Mark, the consumer buying power of Black Americans is huge. And if you want us to buy your product, you're going to have to show us somebody that we can relate to. Even though we were buying the products before, it will increase. And we do see this. We pay attention. We notice. And it's all money based, of course.
Yeah, and to plug my history of mass communication course, we read the book Slave in a Box, and it was about Aunt Jemima and the history of how she kind of became to be this symbol. And I think in reading that, a lot of my classmates were just kind of like, whoa, what? And I was like, okay, let's just ask, how many mascots for food products are white? Silence. And Land O'Lakes was just under a lot of protest. There's Uncle Ben's and there's Aunt Jemima, and I'm just like, they're seeing it now, they understand it. And so I think even just in incorporating that like modern-ish piece, but realizing how far back it goes to Jim Crow minstrelsy, and like you saw this image and decided to make it the image for your instant pancake mix. And then you created this whole story surrounding it and nobody thought it was problematic. And then now all of a sudden it's a problem. And so I think that I'm happy to see like companies and organizations kind of rebranding and realizing the racist things that they do. But it is unfortunate that it takes, a pandemic or it takes something really bad to happen for them to realize all these problems, because then it brings back to the question of, well, what do your newsrooms look like? What do your advisors look like? Who are the people making decisions? And even when you see brands like H&M and all of these other fashion organizations who are doing all these things, and it's just kind of like, you put this out there, promoted it with social media, had a press release, had a memo, and nobody thought this was a problem. Let's address that system really quick and let's kind of figure that out. And so I think just as plain as simple, it starts with increasing the diversity in these newsrooms and in these positions of power, because if you can't see it just as simple as this might be a little distasteful, then you're not going to be able to see when you get to the more racist or the microaggression or the macroaggression or all these other different things.
Christine Pedretti said the podcast Planet Money is just did an episode on advertising and race that discusses what we're discussing right now. And Gina said, Vivian mentioned the impact of social media, but how many of those are hiring Black leaders, like Facebook, for instance?
Well, go ask Facebook, go ask Google, go ask Yahoo, go to their CEOs and their HR departments and see how many people are being hired. You would be surprised to find out that there are as many as you might think there are.
Right. You may remember that Jesse Jackson made that a cause about 5-6 years ago when he bought stock in some of the tech companies, attended their board meetings and demanded they become much more diverse in their boards as well as their top executive levels. And I would dare say that 6-7 years later, they're the same percentages now.
Yeah.
Same percentages now.
One thing that I do want to ask you, somebody had asked this before, how are your media outlets treating you, and how have they since when you've been reporters?
So I'll start with that one, and I'll give the answer because we're doing something this week that I think for our company, Gannett, is kind of a leading edge activity. And that is that we've actually decided in all of our markets, and that's 260 markets, to say very clearly online and in print what our diversity figures are in the newsroom and make a public pledge that by 2025, we're going to mirror in our communities, our newsrooms, we're going to mirror the communities we serve. And so what that means for Memphis is that we're about 27% in our newsroom now of minority staffers, of which about 20.5 of that is African Americans. But that is far below our overall coverage area, which is about 50% African American and 57% all minorities. So we have a ways to go, but taking a stand on that publicly, I think is important so people can hold us accountable. And then it's up to me as one of the leaders and the leader of the newsroom to make that happen over time. And I think a stand like that speaks volumes for our company's commitment. And I feel well taken care of in that regard. Because I know that wasn't an easy stand to take at all.
Yeah. You're making waves.
My show, Black Nouveau, which is on Milwaukee PBS, deals with, and our mission is it's an award-winning program that tells stories of triumph and transformation in Milwaukee's African-American community through profiles and interviews of the city's change makers. That's our official statement about Black Nouveau. But Black Nouveau has been on PBS in Milwaukee for over 25 years. This show has been doing stories about African-American communities in and around the Milwaukee area for a long, long time. And I am very honored to be hosting that program now and being able to cover issues that I wasn't able to do before and just take the time to do those stories that I wasn't able to do before. And I think public broadcasting as a whole is pretty representative of the United States, at least it tries to be. So I'm treated well at Milwaukee PBS, and I'm glad to be there.
And Gianna.
Yeah, in my perspective, I really think that the community has made it a lot easier for me to kind of navigate as a journalist and as a student. Like I said, I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. A lot of the people that I've come in contact with for my internships and programs kind of knew my name. I have a very familiar name. People know my name, but people also recognize my face and they recognize the passion and the work that I do. And I think being a student, like the comment about mentoring, it's so important because if you don't have people who you can like speak to or you can like reach out to and have those resources, then if I didn't have that, like if I went to school somewhere else and I didn't have that community, who knows where I would be. And I think that at Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism, I've known them for a very long time. They treat me with so much respect, and I think that they really value my opinion. And I think that it also really does speak volumes to have a very fostering environment. If you're not open to feedback, if you're stuck in your ways, then no one's going to be okay with that, regardless of their race. And I think that because I'm also a student, and so I can kind of navigate that, what I'm learning and what I'm experiencing, and then the technical part of journalism, I think that that kind of makes Wisconsin Watch a great home for me. And I also really love the staff support at the UW School of Journalism and Mass Communication as well, because it's a really tight group of us Black students, but they also really make sure that we all have all the resources that we need and that we're well taken care of, and that whenever we go out somewhere, the Badger alums are there for us. They're like, you go to Madison? Okay, I got you. I'll put you under this person and connect. And so the community is really great.
And I hope we don't neglect to mention the Black press, which has been around in the United States since, I think it's 1832. And the Black press plays an important role in getting our messages and telling our stories, because that's where stories were told that weren't touched by any other media. So they are still very important, and not only for us to read and follow, but for all Americans to take a look at the Black press and see what's on our minds.
And I was going to say, Lynn Iakenta had asked a question about that earlier. Are there Black news services we should be supporting? He used to subscribe to the Amsterdam Times in Manhattan and Frost in Fort Wayne, for example. So thank you. And I know Roland Martin, who we've known from NABJ, has his podcast. So there are a lot of growing number of Black outlets as well. We are 5 minutes away from 1:30, and I have one final question for all of you. First, just thank you so much for doing this. I've loved this conversation, and from the comments in the chat, people are saying thank you for your knowledge and expertise on the topic. So I just want you guys to, one other person asked too, can you just hold up Black and Blue, Joanne? Jeff Pegues. So somebody asked about that. So Jeff Pegues used to work at Fox 6 here in Milwaukee. So he's friends with us, Jeff, Jeff, and Pete.
That's his name right down there.
Yes. So he's the one who wrote that book. So final one thing, round robin, one thing you want each of our attendees to take away. And I'll start with Angiana, then Joanne, and then end with Mark. Oh, did I put you on the spot?
I know. Just trying to think. I would say it would be around community. I think that fostering and having a very healthy and welcoming and also like accountable community is going to be very crucial. Because even if you're in an environment where there's few Black people, holding people accountable is going to make a great difference. And I think that as long as you're welcoming and you're fostering, also interns, I want to, shout out to the interns, making sure that you're supporting your Black journalists as well.
Joanne?
I would just like to say, and I've just lost the picture, but I know you can still hear me. I hope you can still see me.
We see it.
Okay. I would just like to say that before we leave this, even if our viewers stop, I'll try and put Jeff's book in the chat so you'll have that. But I also want to give a little shade for my film, which is called The Exchange in White America, Kaukauna and King 50 Years Later. It's about a student exchange in Wisconsin that happened in 1966 between Black and white students that nobody seems to know about, but you're going to know about it when my film comes out.
And I just put the link to your website in the chat, so I have it ready. And then Mark.
So I'll add on to what's already been said. Before I do that, let me also say that if Angiana is the example of the student journalists that are coming out in the next few years, we're going to be in very good shape in this industry, and we're going to thrive into the future. So it's been a pleasure for me being on this panel and meeting Angiana as well as Joanne and getting to talk to Vivian again. But one thing I want people to remember, and that in terms of holding us accountable, you have a lot of power in terms of suggesting stories, contacting journalists, developing a relationship and a rapport with journalists. So as a member of the community, as a citizen, or as a source, you have to make sure you use your power to contact journalists. They're easy to contact, particularly in these days when everybody's got a LinkedIn account. People are wanting folks to follow them on Twitter and contact them on Facebook. Use those digital tools to get in touch with journalists to suggest what's happening in your community, and then hold us accountable for covering those stories.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, you guys. And I want to bring Gina Green Harris back just to kind of say some final words. Gina?
Absolutely. First of all, round of applause. I know everyone is clapping, and the chats and the phones have been buzzing, just because this has been such a dynamic conversation. So, Gianna, thank you. Joanne, thank you. Mark, thank you. And of course, Vivian, thank you so much for facilitating and moderating this panel discussion. This was absolutely fantastic. I think you guys gave us more than bite-sized morsels. You gave us a full meal. You gave us really great, and I want to say this. You know, oftentimes we have these talks, we have these webinars, but what I felt like was this was just a really great conversation. And conversations work, right? People were able to understand what you were saying, get what you were saying, and then, you know, digest it and then ask a question about it. And so I want to thank you for that, because that is what our community needs. We really need to be able to understand what's happening, what you're saying, and then you gave us things to do. I heard you say, you know, we've got Mark said, come out and challenge reporters, ask the questions of reporters, right? Joanne was saying, make sure we, as reporters, we're not reporters, but making sure you're asking the questions constantly. You're the snoop finders, right? You got to find out the information. And then Angiana, as a student, was just telling us what's happening on the campus, off the campus, and then the support that's needed. So we are incredibly excited. You talked about the Black journalists and just the Blacks who we need to be supporting to help do this work, and accountability. So I want to thank you guys for that. To our audience and our participants, we want to thank you for spending time with us, and encourage you to stay tuned. This is the end of the third webinar, but there will be a fourth, and we will have that information out to you as to what the next topic will be. I encourage you to do the evaluations that will share with us your thoughts, your comments around what you think we should be doing. What did we do that was really inspiring for you? What do you think we can improve on? We really want to make sure we are serving the people. Our motto at this office and in our work is meet the people where they are. We really want to be servant leaders and draw the needs of the community in front of us so that we can actually make a difference for the future. So thank you so much. I believe Vivian is going to prompt you to do something else, but I just want to make sure that you guys know we value your time, we appreciate your presence, and look forward to a long-term relationship, because as we know, as Joanne said, this has been a long time and it's not over yet. So we're all in this together. So thank you so much, and God bless you.
Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
You will receive your survey as soon as we sign up. So thank you so much. Look in your inboxes and please give us feedback, and have a fantastic day.
Take care. Thanks again.
Thank you so much.